Good morning, friends. Good morning to you. Good morning and welcome. Hello to my cousin Bob. On the anniversary of the incredible, complex, and improbable landing on the beaches at Normandy. Good morning to you. I'm so happy to have you here. If you are one of those who, like me, has ancestors who have served at some point in the 20th century, then I would surely love for you to share the word with your friends and family this morning that we're having a little talk about such things. My goal is to help answer some questions, give some useful information, of course, and perhaps more than anything, entertain and inspire a little bit for you to be able to make the most of your own family stories. I've got some special things to share with you this morning. If you're able to hop in the chat room and just say hello from where you're at. I know we got Connecticut in the house, and that's wonderful. I'd love to know if we have friends coming in from any place else. I'm still adjusting things here this morning because I was busy working on these slides, and I got kind of off on a Google tangent and was having a great time doing it, and then I looked at the clock. So here we are, and let's get started, shall we? Last week, last time for Memorial Day, I dedicated my information and remarks towards those who had served before 1900, and really before 1912 here in the United States. And around the world, but especially in the English-speaking countries, the UK and Ireland, and how we find older military records. And my cousin is here from Ireland as I speak. That's good to see you here too, cousin. Thank you. So today, in honor of D-Day, I thought I would focus on a different element of researching our military ancestors, the 20th century. And I don't talk so much about DNA today because really we're close enough to have heard stories from our ancestors while they were still alive, and we know a lot more about this era, the 20th century, and the world wars and Korea. So I'm just going to put up a few slides for refreshers here, and this is in particular for our American audience. This is just a quick overview of how long the branches of the U.S. Armed Forces have been around. And last time we talked about the records that are available at the National Archives. There are some different challenges with World War I and World War II and Korea. Let me put up a quick timeline here because I think it's helpful to sort of keep in mind that while in Europe, the period of combat was much longer. World War I lasted 4 horrible years, especially on the Western Front in Belgium and France. And the Americans kind of got to the game pretty late. We declared war in April, and the first troops got into action in October 1917. But the bulk of American service combat happened between the beginning of 1918 and the end of the war, which was on November 11th, the day that we celebrate the Armistice as our Veterans Day here in America. And in World War II, once again, we were not in the fray from the beginning. In Europe, the war was 6 horrible years, and Some might say that the war in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular probably went on for 12. We got there late. We arrived, and it's sort of good to kind of think about timelines when we're thinking about our ancestors and their activities, our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and in some cases our parents. D-Day was June 6th of 1944. The Nazis surrendered in Berlin in April of 1945. It happened really fast in Europe. Whereas in the Pacific, the action was spread out for a whole lot longer, from basically shortly after Pearl Harbor in the end of 1941 through August of 1945. So a lot depends on where your ancestors served. Good morning, Karen. I'm glad to have you here. And then the time frame between the end of World War II and the outbreak of hot war as opposed to Cold War in Korea is barely 5 years. And some of what I'm going to talk about today has to do with my wife's family and her dad's experience in Korea in the holidays of 1950, when the Chinese army overran great swaths of the U.S. positions. Quite a story to tell there. So let me, and when it comes to the world wars, I have a little bit of unusual experience, I suppose, for an American, because my own family lost one of my mom's Canadian uncles on the fields of France in 1917 during the trench warfare at a place called the Ypres Salient. Basically, when they were fighting back and forth over these dug-in lines, every now and then one army or the other would move their position forward for a while, and that bulge, that salient, became quite a hot spot for conflict. So let's talk a little bit about 20th century military records. And here in the States, we are used to finding a lot of our military records online at the either Fold 3 or through one of the various portals to the National Archives, or go into the National Archives, as I've been lucky enough to do in D.C., where I've seen my Civil War ancestors and Revolutionary War ancestors records. However, some interesting things about that. It's not quite so cut and dried in 20th century records. A large majority of the service records here in America were lost in the St. Louis archive fire in 1973. I've got more about that in a moment, but what that does is it puts us in a rather difficult position in knowing where our ancestors have been and what theater they were serving in isn't available so much on their service record. However, they did draft cards both for World War I and for World War II, and in addition to filling out the selective service cards, which are all online at Family Search and Ancestry and a couple of other portals, I believe, too. Those draft cards have a lot of clues on them, but in particular, World War II, there was what they call the old men's draft. And it wasn't so much that these gentlemen who'd been born in the late 1870s to 1897 were ever going to be drafted into combat, but it was sort of an inventory of the industrial expertise of the nation. And so these old man draft cards are also available. Lots of useful genealogy on them, things like parent names and next of kin and where they were born. Lots of useful stuff. So in spite of not having the service records at our disposal, we do have some great resources. So when we're searching for records, there's a few things to keep in mind. Privacy in the UK and Ireland is different than it is here in the States. Whereas over there, it's basically a century before records open up. So say for census records, next year we'll be starting to see the 1921 census in the UK and Ireland. Whereas here, it's 72 years. So we're able to see World War II records. We're able to see census records from 1940. And these are really valuable clues. because what we really need to do is fill in a lot of blanks. So that St. Louis archive fire was devastating for a lot of reasons. 80% of the Army's service records that were kept between 1912 and 1960. That's basically only 1 out of 5 servicemen's Army members' records are liable to have survived from World War I or World War II. And unfortunately, Air Force service records, which particularly affects the Korean conflict between 1950 and 53. And those service records were filed alphabetically, and so anything beginning A through H, if you had an ancestor in the Air Force who served in Korea, those records may have been salvaged. Anything from Hubbard on downward was lost in the fire. And unfortunately, I know this last part from personal experience because my wife's father went into Korea as part of the National Guard from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and those records were on loan to the National Archive, the military archive at St. Louis when the fire happened. So we have none of his service records. Now, for all of these things, it is a terrible loss to have this. However, I want to sort of outline a way forward about these things. Obviously, we have these draft records, and those draft records combined with census data really can give us a pretty decent picture of most of the first half of the 20th century. But there are a couple of things that I would point out that can be very valuable, and I've put these to a lot of use myself. So here's our hot tip for the day. Track their units. Because so many men came home from the war, there were lots of course, anyone who has gone through this shared trauma experience tends to want to associate with their fellows who have shared these experiences. And so the units have their own societies to have reunions and to stay in touch after the war. And so there is a lot of collective wisdom to all of that. There are a lot of unit histories that have been preserved in a variety of settings, much like the Civil War unit histories are available online. So too are many of the units from World War I and World War II and Korea. And these are sort of, they've been living memory kind of storytelling opportunities and connection, but you can also see a pretty reliable sort of crowdsourced history of a unit during that combat. And then, of course, the other thing is that most of us have lived with people who experienced at least World War II and or Korea personally. So instead of us trying to make it across 2 or 3 generations of confusion and time periods since there was a first-hand account, many of us have heard accounts from people who lived through those times, or from people who heard it from people who lived through those times. Well, obviously, we're closer to it. So this anecdotal evidence, oral histories, have a lot of clues to them. Now, I certainly would point out that there was good reason for many of these veterans to come home from the world wars and simply not ever want to talk about it. And many folks have had that experience when trying to learn about their family stories. These oral histories can be affected by traumas that they brought home with them too. While some folks are willing to talk about it, it is really hard to keep all of the details straight when one is in the intensity of a life-threatening situation like combat. So these things work together. These oral histories give us clues that we can research. Their unit histories give us some really valuable insights into things that we should check out, the movement of a unit. And the reason that I say all of this is because my own experience with this has been through my wife's family. Michelle's dad was a Korean War veteran. He was in the Army in that summer of 1950 and marched towards the Chinese border and pushed aside the North Korean resistance and found himself caught up in the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. We know this because it's been told to us. Her uncle, who passed away just a few weeks ago from coronavirus, had always talked about how Michelle's dad had been at the Chosin Reservoir. And we have a unit patch that he, from his uniform, and we looked them up, and it turned out that his division had been with the Western Force and not at the Chosin Reservoir, still overrun by the Chinese in a brutally cold winter in North Korea. But there is uncertainty. Was he at Chosin because he was with a different army unit, or was he actually on the western thrust towards the Chinese border? It's hard for us to know. However, what I do know is that he spent a whole lot of his life dealing with the repercussions of that service and that trauma, and I can only imagine what that was like. In my own life, Arnie, it's so good to see you. Thank you for being here. In my own life, I have been lucky enough to spend some time working with veterans who've come home with the invisible wounds of war and are coping with their trauma in a lot of different ways. And one of the therapies that my friend Mac Bailey has introduced is songwriting with veterans. I find that it's pretty sacred work, and it's pretty amazing to me to have the experience to sit one-on-one and hear a vet tell his story and try to help them reframe, rewire, and revisit that experience in a different way, to see themselves, to see their story as others see it, instead of as being wholly informed by the internal trauma of it. I'm grateful that I've had a chance to do it. So I'm going to, my musical offering for today is something from that project. I'm going to hopefully, when we get a chance to start working with veterans one-on-one in person again, as the pandemic eases, I certainly look forward to the next project being an album of songs written by, for, and with these wounded warriors. One of the fellas that I got to work with was a corpsman who worked in mortuary affairs. And that means greeting the planes coming back at Dover. It means going out under fire on the battlefield in Iraq and helping recover the fallen. And his story was pretty powerful and amazing to me. And so he, like many of these vets, found himself at a moment of wanting to check out. And his wife was savvy enough to understand what was going on and intervened. And in the aftermath of that, she and he were talking, and she said, you know, what's changed is that, you know, that was your mission then. Now you have a family, and we love you and we support you, and this is your new mission now. Duty calls in many ways. I chose to serve the fallen, sent home to Dover Air Force Base, awaiting love's final calling. Do your job, get each detail right, and honor guarded with all my might. And I'm gonna make sure that you get home. These eyes have seen families cry, these arms bear the reasons why, this heart that survived somehow to take a new mission now. But this is my mission now. I didn't know why they'd haunt my dreams till I found that I was falling, wrapped up in an angel's wings. mission now, for this is my mission now. The baby boy sleeps gently. He wears me a widow's name. Now this grandfather's aching heart, once again broken open and changed. Family's everything to me, a love I guard with all that I can be. And I'm gonna make sure you're safe each night. These eyes have seen the families cry. These arms bear the reasons why. This heart that survives somehow to take a new mission now. To take a new mission now. To take a new mission now. For this is my mission now. That's for my friend Alex. He's kind enough to share his story with me. I do indeed archive these. I've been building a playlist of each of these webinars, and I really hope they're helpful to you. If anybody has a question, now would be a great time to pop it in the chat room. I certainly have spent some time working with my cousin Bob on, and as he worked through finding his dad's family military history in World War II, and got his name added to the memorial plaque in their town in Connecticut, which is a fabulous reason to do this work. It's funny, we sort of get into this because we're curious, and we wind up doing things. We wind up finding that things have been forgotten, or things that should have been done never did, and then it gives us the opportunity to sort of connect to that in our own way, much like my experience with my Civil War veteran artist Culver, and being able to dedicate a proper headstone for him on Veterans Day last year. So if there are no more questions, I will go ahead and let you know that next week I would really like to not have anybody miss this, because I'm going to do something kind of special next weekend. It's Family History Day, and in celebration of Family History Day on Sunday, I'm going to do two things. One is this time slot here at YouTube, I'm going to do my my more DNA-oriented workshop called The Gifts in Our Genes. It's part anecdotes, parts useful information and hot tips and lots of other stuff, and some music too, obviously, because all of these things are tied together in my life. So the musical is the piece of it is really taking what I've found and wrapping a big shiny bow around it and presenting it in an entirely different and creative way. And I do hope you enjoy those things. And then on Sunday night next week, on actual Family History Day, will be my only ticketed concert for the month. So for those of you who've been so generous at buying tickets and coming to my online shows, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Tickets are already on sale at the website. They're on sale for just $10 right now, and if you get them before the 10th, they'll be $10, and after that they go up to $15. And of course, whatever you feel like doing, I'm grateful for, because you're helping to keep the lights on and the mortgage paid and all of the other stuff that goes along with that in these crazy times when I am home 100% of the time instead of being on the road and traveling. And I've been very much enjoying the opportunity to share some of what I've learned, some of the things that you've read about in the book. For those of you who have the book and have read it, I hope you've been enjoying it. Please do feel free to leave a review over at goodreads.com if you're so inclined. And all of those things are pretty helpful. There's a national publicity campaign going on for the book now, and every good review is a useful and helpful thing, or at Amazon, either or. So, and if you don't have the book and album yet, I would love for you to have it. That's how you can get it, right there at the website. And of course, thank you for the donations that help pay my salary for doing this. I'm enjoying very much sort of creating my own career here in this time of pandemic. If this is what I'm to do, is to share the things I've learned and hopefully share the inspiration and learn a lot along the way myself, well, then that's not such a bad job. So I'm grateful for all of that. So I hope this has been useful to you this morning. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that for those of you who are researching your ancestors, that their stories are certainly worth telling. One thing that I forgot to mention when talking about our World War II ancestors, there up until the end of World War II, here in the United States, most of our units were organized by geography. In other words, in the Civil War, for instance, my ancestor signed up in his hometown of Bristol, and their unit was raised from right around Bristol, Connecticut. After D-Day, that policy was revisited. The National D-Day Memorial is here in Virginia, in Bedford. And it's there because this small Appalachian town of 3,000 or 4,000 lost 23 of her young men on Omaha Beach on this day. And the hole that tore through a small town like that is simply incomprehensible. So after that, military units were no longer organized by geography here in the United States. And so that's a useful bit to keep in mind as you're doing your work too. So with that, if there are no questions, I will say thank you again for tuning in. As always, I greatly appreciate it. I will be on Facebook on Monday doing a free show for a half an hour at 4 o'clock Eastern Time. That's 9 o'clock across the Atlantic in Ireland and the UK, and 1 o'clock out on the West Coast to take a late lunch. Join me from wherever you're at, and there's no point or purpose to those other than to spend a little time sharing some music and giving a little something back. So if you can join me on Monday at 4 o'clock, I'd love to see you. I hope to see you next weekend. Please, if you have friends who are doing family research that involves DNA in particular, do make a point of spreading the word to come to the workshop right here, The Gifts in Our Genes, Saturday morning at 11. And I will look very much forward to seeing you then. Enjoy this lovely weekend. Stay strong, stay well, take care of yourselves and your neighbors, and above all, stay kind. I look forward very much to seeing you soon. Have a great day.